Hello, YouTube. I haven't posted a video of any kind in a long, long time. Um, Posting videos has just never been much of my thing, and I largely just enjoy the other experience, listening to other people talk and share their viewpoints and opinions. I tend to write a lot, but I've also discovered that, yep, people don't tend to write the things that I think about, and I care about a lot of issues passionately, and maybe it's a little bit of hubris and ego on my part, but I'd like people to read more of the stuff I write. Um, so I've decided to take a little experiment, and rather than write a 20 paragraph essay about a topic, just to sit here and speak about it. And I'm really not concerned that people will or will not agree with me. Um, if anything, I invite dissent, because at least with dissent and negative comments and all those things, at least you can begin a conversation. I'm of a mind that a lot of the things in this world that people tend to view as black and white issues simply aren't. They can't be black and white, no matter how much we might socially or politically wish them to be. Now, to clarify and to state some of my biases right up front, I'm an atheist. I don't really care for the word because it doesn't say much about me. I'm a secular humanist, and I consider myself politically progressive and liberal. Having said all that, I don't particularly care about political parties. Um, I don't think the Democratic Party as a whole represents my views politically. And one of the points I want to speak to is the fact that political viewpoints are so polarized that it's interfering with our ability to actually look at issues and ask important questions. Now, I'm certainly not an expert on anything. Uh, I have an eidetic memory. I have dedicated myself to learning more about the world around me as just a hobby for pretty much my entire life. It's unique to how I was raised, perhaps, because I've been reaching out of the box of scholastic education uh, since I was a small child. I'm grateful for the fact that my mother instilled in me and my brother those kind of lessons to continue to learn all the time. And I'm not claiming to be an expert or have expertise, but I think you can demonstrate if you're also a critical thinker and a skeptic that you might not have all the right answers to things, but you can usually identify the bullshit in whatever a given topic is. You can see the wrong things. The wrong things show up more glaringly, especially if you understand what biases are. Indeed, I think our education system fails our children and students poorly by not teaching people how to think and how to recognize biases such as implicit biases, confirmation bias, and the like. Um, and I'm not saying that to imply that I'm not going to bring any biases to the table. Of course I have biases, everyone does. Now, to speak to what I wanted to talk about, we're going to talk about coronavirus. And because it's the thing, it's what's going on. We've got potentially about 4 billion people in the world being told what to do on a daily basis. Stay home, don't go here. And this is having a real world effect. It cannot be understated that we're in a paradigm, not only in my country, but in every country, where we're inside of what potentially may become a new normal. There are some inconsistencies in the way this issue is approached, though, that I feel like, at least to me, need to be addressed and pointed out. And these are due to what I think are overly simplistic viewpoints and the tendencies of human beings to react to things poorly because of their own biases. Now, before I say anything, I'm going to preface what I'm about to say by saying my philosophy is as such. Every human being needs to recognize that empathy is probably the most important social tool we have. You have to be empathetic towards others. Nobody in this world, nobody, not me, not you, no one can live their life without the empathetic support of others, and vice versa. There is no, there is no person who stands alone. Nobody. This is not pioneer pre-industrial era America, where you have to build your own log cabin and hunt your own animals and blah, 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 and you can actually make your own life on your own. We just don't live that way anymore. We haven't lived that way for a very long time. We rely on other people to live our lives, and so we can't approach an issue like this solely focusing on our own implicit fears and ego and biases. At the same time, we have to be realistic and recognize that an infectious disease doesn't have an ego or biases. It is not human. And so we cannot make the mistake of trying to anthropomorphize it and give it agency it doesn't have. Viruses don't care. We care. So the first point I want to bring up is social distancing. Why do we do this? I think some people are under mistaken impression with the current rate of social distancing we are operating under in this country, and it varies by state, and in other countries, and it varies by country, that this social distancing is some sort of panacea, some sort of quick fix, and it doesn't really matter whether we open things back up today, next week, 3 months from now, 6 months from now. Most people misunderstand what the purpose of social distancing is. And what the purpose is to, and this has been quoted plenty of times, and I don't think people understand it, it's to lower the curve. It's to lower the rates of infection. It is not, in a disease that possesses this sort of virulence, a measure that is going to successfully eradicate the disease. Okay? It's just not. And I think any epidemiologist worth his salt is going to tell you that. But people misunderstand. They assume, well, if we social distance for long enough, then we can get back to normal. We might be able to get back to something vaguely resembling normal. But no matter when we decide to stop social distancing, at least in the way we look at it, this disease isn't going to go away. It's not all going to be fluffy kittens and rainbows 6 months from now. And some of the decisions in states like Georgia and my own state, South Carolina, to begin opening things back up will have consequences. And unfortunately, it looks like we need those types of decisions being made so that we will have some information about when and what we should be doing. And this sounds terribly unkind. It does. It sounds terribly unkind to admit that some states are just making educated guesses about what they should be doing and potentially putting the population at some levels of risk. The reality, however, is much more sober. We will have to eventually open things up. There's no way around it. And it doesn't matter, again, whether it's today, this week, 3 months from now, 6 months from now. There will be consequences to that. They're unavoidable. The goal, ideally, is to have as low a loss of human life as we can possibly attain. And that's the goal. The goal is not to eliminate the disease this way. That's not how virology and epidemiology work. In order to achieve herd immunity, and this topic is sort of specious for this type of virus, given what we know about coronaviruses. We have 2 strains of coronavirus that are involved in what we refer to as the common cold. There are 2 strains of coronavirus that are involved there. And these viruses that we call the common cold are just an amalgam of viral infections that have similar symptoms, similar health outcomes. And The reason why we don't have vaccines for these, and there's a class of viruses that cause the common cold, is because they tend to mutate. They tend to be seasonal, and we don't appear to get a whole lot of immunity from them. But we also know that people largely don't die from the common cold. The death rates of the common cold are abysmally, astonishingly, amazingly, stupendously low, much lower than influenza, the flu. So we may not even get a vaccine that's effective. We don't know yet. That's not gloom and doom. That's just stating what we know so far. People who have COVID-19 and end up getting through it and they're back healthy with no infection may not gain ample antibodies in order to have long-term immunity. That's common with other viruses of this type. And so that might be the future going ahead. What we do know is that if we try to approach things like herd immunity, I think in the United States now there are a little bit over 1 million cases, a little bit over 60,000 deaths. This is May 2nd. In order to achieve herd immunity, we're going to have to get somewhere from 50 to 70% of the population with the disease, so that the R rate, the rate of potential infection, is mitigated by the fact that enough people have antibody protection from the disease. And so the way forward is, I mean, you look at the numbers there, we're talking about close to 200 million individuals in our country alone. And so it is conceivable that we need to achieve herd immunity, whether it's through infection or whether it's through seasonal vaccines or through antivirals. And there's at least one antiviral that I can't pronounce that is showing some promise in shortening the window of the infection and lessening the symptoms. Not doing anything but doing that, the same way in which we approach how we use things like Tamiflu to help mitigate the flu. But we're not going to have anything remotely resembling a proper outcome from this until we reach herd immunity thresholds, or we develop antivirals, and we use those in tandem to get this disease, this viral infection, down to a level of what we accept. And herein lies the rub. Most people don't think about the seasonal flu. And I think it's important to look at both the seasonal flu and the 1918 influenza pandemic. There were two different strains of flu. I believe the 1918 pandemic was H1N1. So much to keep track of. I'm not an epidemiologist. But what we do know is over the course of a couple of years, 50 million people died from the 1918 pandemic. And you have to keep in mind that we are not going to see those levels of death from coronavirus. We're just not. And the reason why I can say that with reasonable confidence is, well, several reasons. Number one, the Spanish flu pandemic was largely driven by the end of World War I, where all these soldiers bringing these infections back from the battlefield went home, and they spread the disease across many, many nations. We can also recognize that 1918 was a little bit over a century ago, and the best health care that was available then was akin to what we would find in a remote Somali village today. And so healthcare just wasn't what it is today. And also, we have much better behaviors in the way of sanitation, cleanliness, and overall social behaviors that tend to make us less susceptible and prone to disease. The last rail, which is important for Western civilization, is we actually have vaccines and we vaccinate for things. And just like that, we can talk about the modern seasonal flu. And we have a global healthcare system in place, a global system to deal with influenza. And that's the reason why we don't think about it. Even though, and this is a sobering statistic, given light to how people overreact and underreact to COVID-19, that even to this day, anywhere from, I think the figures were somewhere in the low 200,000s to the higher 600-ish thousands, according to the CDC, die every year from flu. So, yeah, average that, it's about 500,000 people a year die from flu. Nobody loses sleep over this. Nobody is writing headlines in major news publications that 500,000 people a year die from the flu. And there's a reason for it. It's a social, cultural, and political set of reasons. In the case of the flu, which we recognize is seasonal, that it comes back with a storm every year, and that we're usually not quite certain which particular strains of flu are going to be prevalent in a given population. And still, we have a medical system in place, with the top tier being vaccinations. We vaccinate. We try to vaccinate our most vulnerable populations as a course of habit, not only in the United States but worldwide. We vaccinate, and we have treatment protocols. We have antiviral medications, which can help shorten the window of the range of a flu virus's infection, which also lowers the symptoms and the symptomatic rates. And then we have treatment protocols. By and large, people who develop influenza end up developing bacterial infections in their lungs, pneumonia, which is the number one killer when it comes to flu. It's not the flu that actually kills, it's the consequences of the flu that kills. And yet, we have 500,000 people dying every year. The reason we don't overreact and panic about it is because the world recognizes that we have a global system of healthcare in place with strategies to cope with this. And we have socially and culturally accepted that this is the best we can do. And that's an important distinction to make here. It's a way of thinking about this that we need to embrace going forward with COVID-19. Right now, we don't know what the best we can do is. Because COVID-19 is not the flu. It has different virility. It has different symptom presentation. It presents at least some that are completely asymptomatic while having the infection. And then it has outlier effects on people with existing health conditions. We just don't know a lot yet. We know more than enough to know what we should be doing, but we still haven't developed all of the tools that we have in place with something that we deal with on an annual basis, like the flu. And we won't feel better about this until we do. Right now, we don't have that. So we don't have a situation with COVID-19 where we can say, this is the best we can do. But you'll see a lot of the political rhetoric on either side of the issue saying precisely that without coming out and saying it. And this brings me to the second point I want to bring up. People on the other side of the argument. Now, I'm all for social distancing, and I don't really care, how long we have to be doing this. I'm not a medical expert. And, I understand mathematics and statistical analysis. I do understand those things. But I'm not qualified to understand those things in the scope of a global pandemic. But I can look at the numbers and I can see and recognize that I don't have the expertise to have an opinion that's sweeping to say, oh, we should open the country up or we should not. We have to leave these things to people who have expertise. We just have to. But we can point out the realities and realize that this situation isn't as simple as anyone assumes it is, because it's just not. And so this first part is, social distancing. You need to understand what it is and why it exists. It's to lower that curve. And lowering that curve is not about necessarily keeping people safe in a broad sense. And let me explain that. It's about lowering the curve so that we can cope with infections and severe conditions that lead to people being in ICUs, so that our healthcare system doesn't collapse as a result. I mean, you can have an infectious disease that can go boom, and go way up in infections, and way up in mortality rate, and eventually it hits some sort of threshold, and then it begins to decline. The problem is the peak of that curve. Now, if in the narrow window of a curve, let's just say for argument 100,000 people end up in ICUs in a 30-day window. I'm trying to make a math argument here so you understand what I'm saying. The American Hospital Association doesn't actually keep accurate, precise numbers on the number of ICU beds we have in this country. They have accountings for about 80%, but they break them down based on ICU speciality. So the best case guess we have prior to the pandemic is the United States has about 150,000 ICU beds. About 150,000 or less. That's, given the numbers I've looked at, that's basically what we've got to work with. If we overwhelm that in a short window, then doctors are going to be like doctors in Italy, having to make decisions about who they choose to treat. Now we can have that same number of ICU hospitalizations over a 3-month window. And we're going to end up with a medical system that is better able to cope. Flattening the curve is about extending the amount of time we're going to deal with this. It's literally about making this last longer so that we can cope with it. It's not about making it go away quicker. It's actually quite the opposite. It's about accepting that this isn't going to go away unless we treat it based on the knowledge we have of infectious disease. And so the right thing to do is to actually prolong the situation we're dealing with to an extent, so that our capacity to cope with it in our national healthcare system isn't overran. And so anyone thinking, conversely, that if we just continue to social distance, that we're going to magically just flush this turd and be done with it, we don't have the time for that. And this brings us up to the second part of this that needs to be discussed. It's a part that's discussed a lot on the right, and I think a lot of people on the right don't get this right for the right reasons, and I think a lot of people on the left knee-jerk react to this without thinking it through. And it's because our emotional biases tend to make us overvalue things perhaps that we shouldn't. And these things go counter to our empathy, our desire to not see people suffer. And the second point is simply we're going to have to open up the country. We're going to have to. There's no way around it. We have to. And regardless of when we do it, whether it's this week or 3 months from now or 6 months from now or a year from now, there will be consequences. There will be consequences in the fact that actual real live human beings actually die. And that sounds heartless to say, but it is nonetheless true. There will be deaths. And we don't know, and you can look at the actions of different governors in different states, and you can look at actions on the federal level, and you can really see that between the epidemiology and the science and the politics and the economics, that nobody really knows what to do. And so each of these individual decisions by states, they're unfortunately part of a grand experiment. Because we can't afford to stay closed. We can't afford this. Right now, we have record levels of unemployment, never before seen in the United States, even when factoring in the Great Depression. Great Depression is the only thing that compares when you look at just the raw numbers of unemployment. It's the only thing that compares. 2008, was a speed bump compared to the unemployment rate we have right now. It was a speed bump. And keep in mind, the peak unemployment rates in the 2008 crisis, which I think reached 8.9 million Americans out of work, took the better part of 7 to 8 years to solve. Now, granted, a lot of the jobs, once things open up, will magically go in, because a lot of the people in the United States now are on furlough and not just fired. But to think that we will be able to put all these people back to work in a scant few months instead of years, just look at the data. It's not going to be that simple. So we face a looming economic crisis that we're already feeling a lot of pain from. 70% of the United States economy is consumption, buying things. And if there's anything that's going on in this pandemic crisis, is that people are not buying stuff. They're just not. They're buying food, but even the food buying is changing. We now have mass shortages on shelves of flour because so many more people are staying at home and cooking. And so we're experiencing flour levels dropping on retail shelves that are akin to how flour levels drop during the run-ups to Thanksgiving and Christmas. We have large pork shortages because Smithfield can't seem to keep all of its factories open, because it's difficult to socially distance in an intensive, meat slaughtering facility. Just can't be done. So we're going to have to open things up. There's no way around it. And there will be painful costs for that. There's no way around that either. If the economy tanks, people's livelihoods tank. People need jobs. They need work. They need money in order to be able to live. And the economy as a whole needs people buying things. That cannot be more overstated. The only way out of this is for people to accept that this is not a black and white situation. People have to be patient, and they have to be mindful that the decision-making processes are out of our hands. People also need to not fall prey to and succumb to a lot of the ways in which the news media approaches this. And I say this on both sides of the political spectrum. I think you need to be skeptical and critical of everything, even the things that you might agree with. I agree that some of the states opening up too soon is occurring. But I also understand why these things are happening. Because there hasn't been a concerted national response to solving the economic issues. Everybody got a $1,200 stimulus check, whoopty shit. And they've added extra money to the unemployment insurance. Whoopty shit. Some people can't qualify for that. Some people who've been laid off and furloughed can't. People who own small businesses can't. And the small business funds dried up in a matter of days the first go around. Same thing appears to be happening with the second wave. There's not enough money being pushed into the economy, and I don't think the economists and politicians at the head of this realize that if we do delay, because it's the scientifically correct thing to do, if we do delay opening things up, if we keep the restaurant industry basically under boot, restaurant, hair care, all the things that actually require physical human beings to be closely engaged with one another, which are a significantly huge chunk of our economy. Once we keep those things under boot, we're going to have to pay those people. Because if we don't, poverty is going to explode. Homelessness is going to explode. It's going to trickle up into other systems. Apartment complexes and rental properties. People are going to default on mortgages because they've overextended themselves and have mortgages on all these properties they rent, etc., etc. You could go on and on with this. We're months away from many specific industries in the United States utterly collapsing, because we can't keep doing this unless there is a concerted effort by our governments to continue pumping money into the problem. our governments have done this before. This was how the United States made it through World War II. And I have to mention that, yeah, that involves some things that we couldn't cope with today. Rationing of food, gas stamps, not being able to buy certain things simply because they're not being made anymore. In our case, it's because they're not being imported anymore. These are painful realities, and I just want people's thoughts and ideas on what they think about it. There's no free lunch here, people. No matter what we do, there's going to be some pain. And we will get to a point, unfortunately, in the future where, and it seems the evidence is leading towards this conclusion, that coronavirus is just going to become a new normal in probably a couple of years. We just deal with it the same way we deal with seasonal colds and flu, and we'll throw our best science and our best healthcare at it. There will be some death annually going forward, and we'll just have to accept it the same way we do with colds, flus, and everything else in Mother Nature that doesn't care about us.